So with me now is Edward Kieswetter. This is the executive exchange on Moneyweb TV, and I have been chasing the commissioner for this interview for quite a while. So I am delighted to have you in studio, and I'm going to have a wide-ranging discussion with you for the next 20 minutes. There are many of your leadership insights that I want to deep dive into. But let's go back to 2019. When you accepted the position as Commissioner of SARS. That was state capture. You walked in to this institution that was completely broken. How did you feel?
You know, Bronwyn, firstly, thank you for finally catching up with me as per your intro. But, obviously I had been following the news, the Nugent Commission. I had read the report. And so I had a good sense at a intellectual level what the state of the organization was. But nothing could prepare me for the actual trauma, brokenness, level of distrust, and the erosion just of social cohesion that the organization was left with post this assault through state capture. And so that became clear immediately when I started meeting people, looking into their eyes. Very often when I asked people to recount their experiences, they would break down, in tears. And when I spoke to people going around the offices, listening to their heartbreak, that's when you really got a sense that even though processes and organizational arrangements and governance arrangements had been dismantled, that the real damage to SARS was the impact on its people.
Was there a moment, Commissioner, when you seriously considered whether SARS could be rebuilt or not?
The knowledge that I had about the people I had left 10 years earlier, their level of commitment, their professionalism, their knowledge, their institutional memory, many of them still there, about 60, 70 of them were just marginalized. And on the ground, people that had worked with me a decade earlier were still there. So I knew that SARS had not lost its core competence that resided in the hearts and the minds of people. You sensed that, like a candle was flickering in the wind, the higher purpose orientation just needed to be fanned again, and it would go from a flicker into a raging fire again. And because it was still there, that the contribution by people that had been masked when they retreated out of fear, because a culture of fear and intimidation had come about, that if they developed a sense of self-belief again, that they would come out of hiding and they would step to the fore. So my conviction and my confidence was not actually in my ability. It was in knowing that I come back to an organization that had deep residual competence, a deep residual sense of higher purpose, and that my job was really as the orchestra leader to unlock all of that and allow people to play to the tune that they knew and at the level of skill that they had already demonstrated in the past. And so my work was about creating a vision that would inspire them, building deep trust that would give them confidence and strategic clarity. And our playbook is on the record. It is an enduring playbook. And I know that if the new commissioner continues in that vein, SARS will, in the next 5 to 10 years, grow significantly more than even what we've achieved in the 7 years. So I didn't step into it with, I can do it kind of confidence, I stepped into it with, I know who I'm going to work with, confidence. And that made the leadership job for me a lot more achievable than what I would have had I not also retained that institutional memory.
Earlier, you mentioned this concept of rebuilding trust, and it's something that I've heard you talk about often, Commissioner, where you had to rebuild trust not only internally, as you've inferred, but also externally with the South African taxpayer. And I suppose before we move on from the past, just going back to that broken organization, where do you start when you have to rebuild that trust both internally and externally?
Trust can be destroyed by one big event, but trust cannot be restored by one big event. To rebuild, to restore trust requires a level of honesty, a leader making him or herself vulnerable, showing up, saying, I don't know. And it is that authenticity that characterizes the engagement with people when they look into your eyes, when they sense your heart. You know, I've learned that people don't remember what you tell them, they remember how it made them feel. And trust for me is every little conversation, everyone who I pass in the corridor, that momentary exchange, whether it's a look, whether it is a question, whether it is a greeting. It is listening to what I say, what I don't say. So trust is the consequence of many, many little things, consistently, reliably, and ultimately predictable. People must not be surprised. You know, I've found that people can deal with honesty, even if it is tough, a lot easier than how they would react afterwards if they know they have been lied to. And so, speaking the truth, even when it is tough, I remember the first conversations with the unions. I called them into the room and I said to them that I make a commitment to you. You will not always agree with what I say. You will not always like what I say. But here is my commitment. I will never lie to you. I will say what is on my heart. I will give you my best sense of what I think a response would be, and I'm happy to engage on it, but I will never lie to you. One of the union leaders at one of my farewells reminded me of that conversation and said to me, Commissioner, I want to say to you, we didn't always like you when you said some things that we didn't, that didn't agree with where we came from. But I want to tell you, you kept your promise. You never lied to us. The same with the public. I decided that given the history of brokenness and distrust between the social contract, because remember in 2019, trust had fallen to 48%. And as the CEO, you cannot delegate your presence. You cannot delegate the work that you have to do of being the voice and the face of the organization. So you will have noticed that I did all the interviews. I engaged the public directly because I knew that if we were going to build trust, then those who represented the organization must be believable. And again, even when the messages were tough, taxpayers would have to feel a level of authenticity in the messages. And I think the fact that 7 years later, trust went from 48 to 75% is an encouraging feedback that we did indeed build trust with the public over the 7 years.
How do you think about leading an organization that is by design unpopular? Nobody likes paying tax, Commissioner. Does that change the way that you lead?
That includes me. Every month I can think of so much more I could do with that tax money. So let me share with you my own conviction. And that's the conviction that has characterized my messages with the public, even those who speak about a tax revolt. Just the fact that you and I are on this platform puts us in a small percentage of privileged people. And privilege is relative, right? So if I think of some of the billionaires in the world, I feel like a pauper. If I feel of the 6 out of every 10 youth in South Africa that are unemployed, not in education and training, I feel inordinately blessed. So privilege is a relative concept. And for me, being employed, having a business that's profitable is an inordinate privilege. And tax is a way of paying that privilege forward to those who are less fortunate, less privileged. Now, obviously, tax morality, what happens to our tax money, a wise and prudent stewardship over the hard-earned resources are all issues that we must take on head-on and we must call it out if it doesn't happen. And I have, during my 7 years, reminded those who will have the stewardship over the allocation and spending of that money. I've called it out when I saw it not happening, because that closes the compact between giving my tax money. I then have a legitimate expectation that I must influence how it is spent. But there is a democracy and democratic processes through which I give effect to that agency. And even a revolt that is driven by what I may feel a justifiable cause still undermines. Our democracy would be unfunded if it weren't for the fact that we had taxpayers who make this contribution. So in a systems manner, we have to, on the one hand, make this contribution, on the other hand, demand quality delivery, fight corruption, speak out when there is inefficiency and wastage.
How do you feel about the current stewardship of that tax money, as you reference?
I'm not happy. I've never been. I mean, just starting with the way SARS is funded, I have on public record that you cannot treat SARS like a cost center. The compounding dividend of a well-functioning revenue authority has incalculable measure. The efficiency of SARS in the most recent demonstration has averted a 2% VAT increase. Just think about that. And think about the downstream effect for a average working class family who spends about 15,000 Rand a month on VATable income. That's a savings of 7,500 Rand a year. For a 500,000 income family, that's a savings of 1,200 Rand. So it's not inconsequential when a 2% VAT increase is averted. And we were able to do that because of a well-functioning revenue authority. We pay over 450 billion of refunds out into the public, and most of that is paid out in under 72 hours. If you think about returning 450 billion into the economy, the multiplier effect that has, apart from feeding hungry mouths or keeping small businesses going, again, the compounding dividend. Now, to treat SARS like a cost center as you would treat NSFAS or any of the other social expenditures. And I'm a big supporter that given our current trajectory, we need to spend 61 cents on social wages, but we can't continue to do that. And so it's short-termism to cut costs where it matters, to allocate costs that will be wasted or indirected or not directed efficiently. So for me, I think we need a first principles review on how we allocate resources in the state And then when we have allocated it, to exact a level of consequence management that demands of those of us who I was a steward of state's resources.
How do we get to that first principle review?
Let's just talk about the domain in which that takes place, which is political. And politics, the sympathy I have for politics, it's the art of the possible. Unlike organizations where a CEO is appointed by a board and can be hired and fired based on performance that are measurable, hardly ever on sentiment. Politicians are not appointed in the same way. Politicians are elected, and they have to try and read the sentiment of those who elected them. Within the party system, the leader, the president, is then identified. Now, fortunately, we've moved beyond a dominant one party into a government of national unity. But whoever is ultimately presented to Parliament, who makes the final election of a president, will still come from a party system and not from citizens. And so the system, I think, is fundamentally produces a level of political popularity rather than competence. And those who are, I was recently asked, what would I do if I were the president? I said, I think the president has a harder job, because as the commissioner of Sars, I had a clear legal mandate. I had a legally defensible appointment, and I could act without fear, favor, or prejudice. And provided I did and worked with integrity and did not subject myself to anything that would be considered delinquent, it would be hard to get rid of me. Whereas the president can be recalled by a vote. So the political context makes it harder, but not impossible. We've seen in countries like China and countries like Singapore, where meritocracy is a absolutely non-negotiable principle of the appointment of leaders. And I don't think our system always produces the most competent leaders on a meritocratic basis. I've always said, when I look for leaders, and I've learned over life, but it's been confirmed by scholarly work that I've done, that there are 5 things that every leader should have. And that doesn't matter whether you serve in public, political, or private space. The first is a leader must be a person of good character. And character is hard to learn. It's the stuff we learn from our parents. I know that my mother and my father had an inordinate impact on my character, and they're still enduring. The second is whether the person has the competence and the attributes for the job. And not all jobs require the same attributes. I could not, if you got into a plane and I was in the cabin, in the cockpit, get off the plane. I don't have the competence to fly. So competence is important for the job. The third is a track record of delivery. Has this person done something similar before? And the fourth one is work ethic. Being a leader is hard work. And the fifth attribute is incorruptibility. So I think if we demanded every single one of our leaders for every role in the political and administrative sphere in public sector, and I'm just confining myself for this purpose to public sector, I think we would deal with the question of how do we allocate resources and how do we spend it a lot more efficiently.
When you look at state-owned entities across the South African space, given your experience at turning around SARS, which one do you feel you could tackle?
At my stage of my career, I should not aspire to tackle any of them. Obviously, the little boy in me thinks it would be fun to fix an airline or a electricity company or an arms company. But that's the little boy in me. I'm a tinkerer. I love fixing things that are broken. But I think what I've also learned is that social institutions needs fixing as well. Just the way we provide social services, the way we provide education. These are legacy institutions that has an enduring effect on next generations if we can run them well. So there's no shortage of problems that needs fixing. I am engaging with a number of ministers at the moment who have asked for some input, some advice. And I know that given just my love for the country and my orientation to public service, some of that trouble will eventually stick.
You say your love for the country. What is your advice to young South Africans who are leaving the country? And perhaps weigh in here not as commissioner, but as a South African.
Yeah, and as a father, I encourage young people to travel. I think they must see the world, see how other systems work. There are many good examples, there are many bad examples in the world. So I encourage young people to to travel and develop a global view, because we live in a world that is connected. But I would ask them, when they have had their global experience, to come home. There is no other country that I would rather be than here. And of course, I have a strong bias for the city of my birth, Cape Town. This morning I speak from Sandton, but if given any opportunity, I would love to wake up more often in Cape Town. So I would say to young people, if you are ever going to make a difference, if you're ever going to be a blessing in the world, then charity begins at home.
And Commissioner, I know you've been very guarded about what the future looks like. You were giving me the sense there that there are a number of options that you're investigating, and I'm sure you are not short of opportunities, with many, many people approaching you from both the private and the public sector. Perhaps I can just get a little direction as to whether you would be more public or you would be more private, given that you've had deep experience in both sectors. Where would your future potentially lie?
I established a company, which I will be making public announcements on soon. But it is about fixing institutions. It is about codifying 40 years of incontestable evidence, whether it was a young power station manager when I fixed my first big complex institution, to my first stint at SARS. Alexander Forbes, I remind you, had, when I joined, R1 billion civil claim, 21 criminal charges, a huge tax risk, barely meeting its financial covenants, and a reputation that was shot. And 4.5 years later, we listed it. And now the last 7 years at SARS, with the record performances and turnaround. So I've looked back, and both for my scholarly work as well as reflecting as a professional, have codified what I thought was let me call it the methodology that I applied. And I've established a company that will institutionalize that methodology. The institutions obviously can be both public and private. I think initially a lot of the work will be in the public space. And then I'm also a teacher. I'm an academic. I still hold 6 visiting professorships. And last week I did a public lecture at UCT, the week before that at UWC. So I will still be a public voice.
Well, you've already walked yourself into the next interview, which is when you do publicize your company. So I'm looking forward to being one of the first voices to engage with you on that conversation. And I look forward to tracking your progress from here, given the impact that you've had on South Africa to this point. Commissioner, thank you very much for your time. It really has been a privilege to have this conversation.